So next I'd like to invite our next panellists to the stage. We have, at least I think we have Charles Baird from Central Digital and Data Office, CDDO at Cabinet Office. I'm hoping we have Firos. We do. Fantastic. Also from CDDO at Cabinet Office, and Jim from MadeTech. So going to be talking about open, shared and sustainable data to support decision making. MadeTech has been doing some really interesting work with various different data platforms across central and local government, and there are some really interesting opportunities that our panellists would like to talk about around collaborating around some shared models and so forth. So perhaps first of all we could just start with a brief introduction to each of you.
I'll be first. Here we go. Hi everyone, I'm Charles Baird. I'm the Head of Data Architecture at the Central Digital and Data Office. I work with Firos, and in our team, the Data Strategy and Standards Directorate, we look at technical and non-technical ways of improving how government manages and exchanges data.
Thanks, Charles. Hi, my name is Firoz Salim, and I'm Head of Frameworks and Standards, and Charles did a pretty good job describing what we do.
Hi everyone, Jim Stamp. I look after the data capability at MadeTech, making sure that our customers, primarily, well, only public sector customers, have the right engineers, scientists, analysts and the capabilities, consulting or delivery, to get the work done that they need to keep delivering those fantastic services that we're starting to see grow in the data space. So yeah, an interesting set of challenges across many customers. So yeah.
Right. Well, to start off with, we must have said the word data already several hundred, if not several thousand times this morning. I feel that the conversation is often kind of missing nuance and context, isn't it? So I think in a panel where we are going to be talking about a lot of very kind of conceptual ideas, could we start off by saying, what do we mean when we say data? And, perhaps what about open data?
I think there's a real... I was reflecting a minute ago on the discussion around API first and sharing data and data access, and I think we're not clear what we mean when we say sharing data. As a software engineer that latterly converted into being a data engineer and then running a team of data engineer and data scientists, I can see that need to share data via APIs is great, and doing that at an operational time and linking up data and making sure that people can talk to one another to make sure that those operational services work is fundamental to how we see those integrated services work. But there is another layer of data that I'm now interested in, which is that data at rest, that analytical services. How do we query data? How do we share that data between departments, within organisations and across organisations, managing that access? And I think identity is useful for APIs, but there's another level of complexity when you separate that operational layer and make it an analytical layer. So I think, yeah, there needs to be that conversation about, are we talking about data for analytical purposes or data for operational purposes? And perhaps having different rules and governance and access management in place to cope with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make. I think also just, I don't have much to add on that, very well put. So to think about, the lack of shared vocabulary about this stuff. I think when we talk about open data, we do sometimes get into trouble because at CDDO we own the policy around open data for government, and to us that's talking about data for transparency, for sharing data about how government is performing. But in more or less technical data circles, sometimes it's talking about the standardization of interfaces and things like that. And I think that we need to be careful where how we place this, because they do mean very different things to very different people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I think when we talk about data also, for me, it's important to think about metadata as well, because that's like a vital component that helps us understand and have a shared understanding of that data and whether it's going to be of use to us. I think that's something we need to focus on and get right.
I think we mentioned in the blurb around sort of semantic stuff, and Charles and I were saying that we could talk for hours on this subject, so we should probably largely avoid it. But I think that connection of metadata and semantic sort of tagging of data, and we were talking about data linkage earlier as well, and that ability to say that that represents the same entity in two different data sets is going to be important to be able to sort of have those conversations and join up potentially the analytical and the operational data sets through that same metadata and that semantic tagging of entities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's not get started. I'm a data architect, so don't get me started on models and ontologies. But I think in the first session, they were talking a lot about linked data, and that is the increasing ability to do that linkage is both crucial to doing some of the, especially the analytical work, but I think we also need to be very aware of the kind of ethical considerations of doing that, because it's very easy. Well, it's not actually. It's really difficult to link data successfully. But having done it, it's very easy to misuse that.
Where do you think the reasoning across data should be? So if we're applying policies at an API level, and we can link that to analytical data through some kind of ontology, how do we push down those policies? How do we move? Defining how a data set and an API should be used through policies is fairly easy. But once you disconnect that data from those APIs and make it queryable in en masse, that then gets even harder to maintain that relationship with the policies that you've applied to that governance level.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I am the guy in the room who always gets cross when people say, "Oh, the tech's easy." Sure, but you know, RBAC or attribute level permissions is relatively well understood, and it's how you get so you bring down governance from that level of these are what's acceptable to user, and then express that as code. To use an expression I don't like very much, but the ability to understand the complexities of governance and then express that in a way that you can automate is going to be crucial.
I mean, do we feel that data has much meaning outside a particular use case?
I think that's where the linkage comes in. I think if you can describe what the data is, what it means, and have an external definition of what it means and how it can be used, it's that metadata that makes it actionable. I think without that metadata, and that could be where it's come from, who's generated, what the policy attached to it, how you action that policy, you know, the external representation of what it is. I think that's where it becomes actionable. I think, you know, a data without metadata is largely pointless.
Yeah. I think, you know, completely agree. I think that, you know, we often run into problems with the fact that data is often useful in situations where it wasn't, you know, purposes it wasn't collected for, and we have to, from a governance perspective, we have to be very careful about defining purpose and making sure that it's well understood what it's going to be. And I think that the more that we can express permissions and what purpose data sets can be used for as metadata, the easier that will get to be.
And I think earlier, Jim, you made the distinction between data for analytical purposes versus data for operational purposes. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that these two things were generally very separate, weren't they? And, you know, data for analysis was often collected specifically for that purpose. You know, it was in the realms of the statisticians, right? Whereas now we're kind of dual purposing. I mean, do you feel that we have, you know, the right kind of governance around that yet? Is it still something we're learning how to do?
I think there's and this is probably your topic more than anyone else's, but the ownership of data and that data as a product and how we design the use of that data. I'm keen with our customers to make sure that the schema that they use for their API is the same schema that they use for their analytical. If we can use the same definition of that data for both purposes, it makes that ownership more defined. It makes it so that it's easy to connect to a database and take a copy of the data for analytical purposes. It's easy for an engineer to change that schema of that database, and that will always catch out a data platform every single time. Whereas if you use the data that's been designed, that people care about, that people feel ownership for, i.e. the API, then it makes it harder for people to change it. As a software engineer, changing an API keeps you awake at night, but changing a database schema is something you do every day without consequence usually. No one sees it. It should be hidden behind something. So yeah, I think that building that ownership in, making sure that people feel that need to maintain professionalism, I think is important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's an ownership model for me that's critical. The accountabilities that lie with different people, because I think whether it's analytical data or data used for operational purposes, we've got to handle it in a way that engenders trust. Whether it's citizens or people, data publishers, people who are providing it. So embedding that in the system, and also understanding how when data is then linked up and becomes an entity in its own right, separate, what happens with that ownership chain, and how is that data then used? So these are all things that we're kind of mulling over. But anyway, I'll stop waffling and hand over to Charles.
Well, so I think ownership is obviously key, and I think that notion of accessing data where it lives rather than moving about and copying it. As you say, it used to be data scientists just get a copy of the data and then they go off and do it. And if you change the models one where the data is being accessed and there's a kind of data exhaust, or data mesh for accessing and using it for analytical purposes, then it allows the data owner to make decisions about that in a way that they're not able to, having just done an SQL dump of a database and handed it over to someone. There's no. I think it's. I personally lose sleep about changing database schemas, so it's it works both ways. But a lot of this about data access is about reassuring the ultimate owner that it's going to be used for the purpose that it was accessed for. And I think giving it that accessing in place gives the owner the ability to audit that effectively, and then say and have that reassurance.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of that data ownership, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, Feroz, your take on this. Is there a kind of emerging, well-defined role of a data owner in government? Who is this person? What do they do? How do they work? What skills should they have?
It's something. Obviously, different departments will have fairly mature models. So what we've been looking at from the centre is thinking, well, across some of the platforms that you've heard people mention, whether it's IDS or DDX that we're looking at, is how can we then build some consensus around those roles when using these platforms? And it's quite there's obviously kind of understood industry best practice kind of roles like owners, stewards, and custodians, but it becomes slightly more complex in when you start looking at when you're creating authoritative sources of data, the role of process owners, so where you've got tax data or data that flows across the system, how you make sure that the experts who understand the process, the business side of it, is has a say in determining how that data is then used, the decisions that make place in that process. So what's clear as I've looked into the issue is just indeed how complex it is, where some want to retain control at the highest levels of seniority, but in others where they're consuming large amounts of data, they want more flexibility. They want more accountabilities kind of delegated down the chain. So it's not a bottleneck, because obviously what we're all hoping to do is see data flow better and quicker so that we can respond quicker to needs. I think there is a sweet spot. I think we probably need a tiered approach that says that, with certain data types, given the sensitivity of it, and also, the potential usage of it, it may need more senior data owner, at the highest level kind of sign off on things. But then some of that, with different types, it can go down to tier 2 or tier 3 and get delegated down. So we're still looking at this issue to try to see if we can build consensus around a model that can then be applied to data sharing platforms.
Well, that's really interesting. And I'm thinking it would be interesting to understand where risk sort of fits into this. Is the role of data owner, is that an absolutely terrifying prospect for somebody? Could this be a kind of career-ending thing, or on the other hand, could it be a role like where risk is actually baked into the process? So you think we've got the really established model of the senior risk owners. How do the two sort of mesh, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So risk is a huge part of it. I think it's about kind of changing the way our perception of data. It's also a huge opportunity to, if you unlock the value of data, to improve public services and improve outcomes for citizens. So it's like, how do we, first of all, we need to change the kind of culture of organisations around data, but we also need to look at, from the roles, see it as an empowering role. But, we can't, it has to be alive to ensuring that, that decisions around data are ethical and that, are lawful, obviously, the baseline for all of this stuff. But also, that we manage, the fact that it's held securely and is accessed in an appropriate way. So I think it's a tricky one, but something we can balance out if we frame it as an opportunity, I think. And a lot of that will be about leadership and, improved kind of data literacy across government as well.
I think risk is the thing that we observe stopping innovation the most. Across all of our customers, so many times we've said, it'd be really useful if we could join that up with, or access this, or share that with, or provide access to. And that risk perception, and it's not just a perception, it's real. People have lost their jobs over these things, and we need to be careful, and somehow we need to bake it into the practices and ways that we work. And I think that decentralization is optimal. I think that's the way that we make things work at the rate which we all wish we could work. And I think the pandemic gave us some good insight into, as we said earlier, how that could happen. But I think at the same time we need to balance that with we can do a lot of damage really quickly if we don't work within those practices and principles. So that decentralization comes with a risk. And as you said, getting that sweet spot, or getting that hierarchy or tiered or layered way of doing it, I think is vital to getting it done. I think how we've seen APIs change over the years and the governance of APIs, how ownership of products and APIs needs to be applied in the same way to analytical data. I think if we can shift that same way of thinking of, we've got a team that looks after this API, and at the same time they provide the data and the governance for the API and the access controls for the APIs using tools like Okta, then need to be applied somehow to
and the notion of the contract around an API is a well-established one now, and I think that the benefits of our approach, or the approach that Fraser is leading on in terms of ownership, is to get a standardised model, so you can say, these are all the risks and this is how they're well understood. And then, it's both really good points that we're not doing this for fun, right? There are really good outcomes to have if we share properly, and therefore it's important to get right. But it's important to give those people whose jobs it is to make sure that nothing bad happens to the data, that they are reassured again by the process, and that these things are. But I do think that Jim makes a really good point about, we understand governance around APIs partly because it's done in a very specific and monitored and audited way, which hasn't historically been true for analytical data, but it could be true if we thought about it more of as a data access in place rather than a copy and shift.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. I wanted to sort of change the topic slightly. I mean, I know that, Jim, you've done quite a bit of work with local government, haven't you? It'd be really interesting to understand kind of how what we're learning in central government, you know, can that be mapped to a kind of local level where the institutions are very different?
I think the problems are very different as well, but I think, well, probably Charles is definitely the right person to talk about whether we can move the learning down and what we have learned. But I think, yeah, there's definitely practices and principles that map between the two domains. I think there's a lot of local government knowledge that could perhaps feed back up to central government as well. I think we've got some good examples. I can see some colleagues in the audience there that have done some good work. And yeah, I think the problems are so different that at times it feels like we can't bridge the gap between central and local, but I think the principles stand. I think the designing data to be shared, to be accessed. Some of the technologies are definitely reusable, but yeah, definitely bow down to it.
I think it's right to have that kind of principles approach. I think in principle the problems are quite similar. It's that when you get to the nitty-gritty of it. But if you think about talking about how do you get access, or how do you share data, that's a problem that maps across central and local government. And I think that one of the things we're trying to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about tooling probably later, is make the things that we do available across central and local government, even if, you know, we're designing them for central government to start with. But the other thing is that a couple of times this morning, communities of practice have come up, and we're really keen on using communities of practice as a way to share knowledge, both across both central and local government. We run the API and data exchange community of practice. We run ONS run the government data architecture community, and those are great for being quite open forum in terms of bringing people in from both central and local government and sharing the knowledge in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think I definitely agree with Jim's point about us being able to learn from local government as well. So we work closely with Iceland UK in the Data Standards Authority. So they've been really on the front foot. So on things like Savvy, which is a vulnerabilities project looking at standards, the taxonomies and all the things that can help us, have a common language around vulnerability. So the focus might change a little bit, and the relationships and the levers. I mean, for us, quite often with central government, as you're aware, we'll focus on central government data sharing because we have greater control and levers between us. So, but I think the biggest opportunities often lie outside of local government. So, I think whenever we look to do something, we should factor in that voice from local government as soon as possible, because it gets that voice of use cases from outside, but it's also then about using their insights to shape the work that we're doing. So yeah.
So on that part, I wonder if there's anybody in the audience from local government or with experienced local government who might want to kind of add anything? Hi. Oh.
Thank you. My name's Juliet Whitworth. I'm the Head of Research and Information at the Local Government Association. So I was really pleased, Rose, to hear you say that actually we ought to bring local government in as early as possible, and I was a bit sad, Jim, to hear you say we should build it for central government and then we can bring local government along later, because I think there are often differences, and once you've started off down a track and it works for one sector, doesn't necessarily mean it works for the other, and then later on you're trying to force a new sector to come in and make the best of what is there, and it just doesn't work well. So I think we would always endorse and support you and even help you link up with local authorities who would be willing to get engaged early on. And in fact, we have tried to do this with the one login, and sadly we got a letter to say we can't extend the scope to local government. It's just going to be for central government, and then we'll do local government. And it won't work so well. At the end of the day, the public sees all these services, all these public services. They don't know if they're local or if they're central, but they will expect to use the same software in the same way. And if you don't involve local government right at the outset, I really worry that you're setting yourselves up to fail. We're setting ourselves up to fail.
Good challenge.
I think it's a really good point, and I think that one of the things, I mean, as Rose said, we in CDDO do engage quite strongly with lots of different local government bodies, but we do occasionally have a kind of reach versus grasp issue in terms of what we are capable of. But there's I'm sure we'll talk about it more before the end of the session, but there's a project that we're working on in partnership with GDS called the Government Data Exchange, GDX, which is a set of tools and it's a bunch of things to help data exchange across the government, but we're very much in a kind of discovery and research phase at the moment, and we're really encouraging local government to get involved in that and make sure that we are covering out the scope of all of the data exchange problems to make sure that some of that does happen.
Love to hear more thoughts, comments, questions from the audience. Sorry.
Hi, I just want to talk a little bit about data owners and data stewardship, and it actually ties into this local, central, arm's length, NHS conversation. So does the panel see a time when this might actually be harmonised? Because, for example, in the NHS, you've got what's now a fairly mature tradition of cold cock guardians making decisions about active data stewardship, evaluating risk and harm, which has now come over to local authorities. You've got data protection officers who in some cases do a similar job. And you have some organisations that are building data ownership, active data management into their leadership strategies in the same way as senior leaders manage budgets, manage HR. You also make decisions about data. You have schemes of delegation and so on. I've worn all of these hats. So I guess my question is, do you see a time when that harmonises? Because I think there's a lot of understanding with dealing with difficult decisions, not just during COVID, but on a smaller scale in local authorities, whenever there is an emergency, for example, a plane crash, a natural disaster, a strong wind, where you make on the fly data sharing decisions. Can we see that coming together?
I think it's something that we're still, as we work through and build consensus around the model, around the use case for data sharing platforms, we're exploring what's possible here. I think different domains, like whether it's NHS, I think there's good reason for having, obviously cold guardians and stuff like that. I think for me the focus is what are the principles that we're trying to push across in terms of good data management practices, and do we have the clear accountabilities for that at different levels? As long as that's across and can be mapped across in every single local policy model, then I don't care really what roles, what titles they've got. I think when it comes to the point of a platform, I think they may need some level of harmonisation, so that when one person's talking about data owner, the other person has that shared understanding. I think that's pretty much where I'm going. I care more about the things that need to happen.
Yeah. We've got a final question from online. So a very practical one. A lot of government bodies migrating their platforms and data onto the cloud. Should they be aware of any particular kind of standards, any kind of agreed strategy they need to consider when doing that?
Can I say yes and leave it at that?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's quite a complicated question, but in terms of data standards, you know, we would encourage people to engage with the Data Standards Authority and visit our nascent data standards catalogue so that people can understand what's in use where and how to design their data to be interoperable, which is crucial. I think that without wanting to play interoperability bingo, there's a real thing about making sure that when you're CDDO, the CTO office in CDDO has a cloud strategy, and I think, and you know, it's referenced in TCOP and the service manual, and I think making sure that those technical elements are adhered to is pretty crucial, and that still gives you quite a lot of freedom on the platform you choose. What do you think, Jim?
It's a big question, is what I think. I think to go from a completely different direction, there's a lot of tools out there that answer a lot of the questions that we think need answering. And it's not until you get into implementing some of these tools that you realise that it says that it's in a UK data centre, but then you find out that the management plane isn't in a UK data centre, and data can leak quite quickly out of the UK. And I'm definitely not going to name names, but yeah, I think there are a lot of magic tools out there that you need to be very careful which ones you choose. Stick to the ones that have been checked, talk to the people who have done it before, and make sure you understand which tools you're choosing, because data can leak out of your data sets, your data centres, and your out of the UK very quickly, even if the actual data looks like it hasn't. The management of that data, and there's a lot of information that goes with that metadata and that management data that very quickly moves to service centres, for example. How do we, if you ring up a service centre and they say, yep, we're on this, they know a lot about your service, your system. They might not see the actual data, but they know the data about the data. And that's a risk. That's a huge risk, and it's not often discussed.
I agree, and I think that is such an interesting point that we should have a whole session on that at the next conference. Note to self. Fantastic. Okay, well, look, I'd like to say a big thank you to our panellists. Really, really interesting session. I know we'll have lots more discussion in the break. So right now we're going to take 25 minutes. We'll be back in here at 11:45, at which point I will hand over gratefully to my co-host, Gavin. And enjoy.